On the morning of July 19, 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda stood in the operations room of the Combined Fleet headquarters in Hiyoshi, a suburb southwest of Tokyo. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of telegraph machines and the low murmur of staff officers updating status boards. Toyoda had been Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet for only 6 weeks, having assumed command after his predecessor, Admiral Minachi Koga, died in a plane crash over the Philippines in March. The news arriving that morning was catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought 4 weeks earlier on June 19th and 20th, had resulted in the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. 3 carriers sunk, approximately 476 aircraft destroyed, over 445 pilots and aircrew killed. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviators, who had once been considered the finest in the world, had been slaughtered in the sky by American pilots flying newer aircraft, guided by superior radar and supported by seemingly inexhaustible logistics. But it was not the battle report that held Toyoda's attention that morning. It was a personnel assessment compiled by the Naval Intelligence Division, finally completed after months of analysis and delivered to his desk with the highest security classification. The report contained a single estimate that changed everything Toyoda thought he understood about the war Japan was fighting. According to the most recent intelligence analysis, the United States Navy had approximately 2.1 million active duty personnel as of July 1944. Japan had been planning this war based on the assumption that America would field perhaps 400,000 sailors at most by this point in the conflict. The actual number was more than 5 times higher. Toyoda read the figure 3 times to ensure he had not misunderstood. 2,100,000. The implications were immediate and absolute. Japan could not win this war. The mathematics were inescapable. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Admiral Toyoda was not a man prone to panic or despair. He had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 40 years, rising through the ranks by demonstrating competence, discipline, and strategic thinking. He had commanded destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. He had served as superintendent of the Naval Academy. He understood naval warfare at every level, from tactics to logistics to grand strategy, and he understood immediately what this personnel estimate meant for Japan's strategic position. The war that Japan had believed it was fighting no longer existed. The assumptions that had guided every operational plan, every resource allocation decision, every strategic calculation for the past 3 years were built on a foundation that had never been real. Japan had gone to war against an enemy it had fundamentally misunderstood. And now, in the summer of 1944, with American forces closing in from multiple directions, the truth had finally become undeniable. To understand how this catastrophic intelligence failure occurred, it is necessary to go back to the years before Pearl Harbor, when Japanese military planners were developing the strategy that would guide their conduct of the Pacific War. The decision to attack the United States was not made lightly or rashly. Japanese leadership understood they were contemplating war against an industrial power with vastly greater economic resources. The entire strategic concept depended on assumptions about American limitations. The plan was elegant in its logic, if flawed in its premises. Japan would strike first, destroying American naval power in the Pacific at Pearl Harbor. With the American Pacific Fleet crippled, Japan would rapidly seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, including the Dutch East Indies, with their oil fields, Malaya with its rubber and tin, and the Philippines with their strategic position astride sea lanes connecting Japan to the southern resources. Japan would then establish a defensive perimeter extending from the Aleutian Islands through the Central Pacific to the Dutch East Indies, and fortify it so thoroughly that any American counteroffensive would be prohibitively costly. The Americans, faced with the prospect of a long, bloody war, to reclaim territories that had never been particularly important to them, would eventually agree to a negotiated settlement that recognized Japan's dominant position in East Asia. The entire strategy rested on three critical assumptions. First, that the initial strike at Pearl Harbor would so severely damage American naval power that it would take years for America to rebuild. Second, that American industrial capacity, while impressive, would be constrained by limited manpower and inability to rapidly mobilize for total war. Third, that American public opinion would not support a prolonged conflict in the Pacific when the war in Europe against Germany demanded attention and resources. All three assumptions were wrong, but the second assumption about American manpower limitations was the most catastrophically incorrect. Japanese military planners in the late 1930s and early 1940s studied American naval capacity extensively. They tracked American ship construction programs. They monitored American naval appropriations. They collected technical intelligence about American vessel designs and capabilities. What they failed to study with equal rigor was the human dimension of American military power. How many people could America actually mobilize for military service? How quickly could they train personnel? What systems existed for converting civilians into sailors? These questions received far less analytical attention than questions about ship tonnage and gun calibers. Japanese naval intelligence estimated in 1941 that the United States Navy would grow from its pre-war strength of approximately 284,000 personnel to perhaps 450,000 by 1943 and perhaps 600,000 by 1945 if America fully mobilized for a protracted conflict. These estimates seemed reasonable to Japanese planners. They were based on careful analysis of American training facilities documented in pre-war naval registers and technical publications. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis graduated approximately 500 officers per year. The Navy operated several training stations with documented capacities. Using these baseline numbers and projecting reasonable expansion, Japanese intelligence calculated maximum sustainable American mobilization. The calculations were methodical and appeared sound, but they were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how America would approach wartime mobilization. Japanese planners assumed that American naval expansion would follow patterns similar to Japan's own mobilization. The Imperial Japanese Navy emphasized quality over quantity. Every sailor was carefully selected and extensively trained. Officers spent years at the Naval Academy. Technical specialists underwent prolonged instruction. Crew training emphasized precision and excellence. This approach produced an exceptionally capable Navy, but one that could not expand rapidly. When the Pacific War began, Japan had approximately 169,000 naval personnel. By the end of the war, that number had grown to roughly 300,000. A near doubling over 4 years was considered significant expansion by Japanese standards. They assumed American expansion would follow similar trajectories, perhaps somewhat faster due to America's larger population and industrial base, but constrained by the same fundamental limitations of training time and quality standards that governed Japanese mobilization. They were projecting their own cultural values and institutional practices onto an enemy that operated from completely different premises. The man who should have recognized this error was Rear Admiral Kanji Ogawa, who served as Director of Naval Intelligence from November 1941 to November 1942, covering the critical first year of the Pacific War. Ogawa was an experienced officer who had served in various intelligence-related assignments throughout his career. He understood the importance of accurate enemy assessment, but Ogawa operated within an institutional structure that systematically devalued intelligence work. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, intelligence was considered a secondary function, far less prestigious than command at sea or staff positions in operations divisions. The most talented officers avoided intelligence assignments because they offered limited opportunities for advancement. Intelligence divisions were chronically understaffed. The entire Naval Intelligence Division in 1941 had fewer than 60 officers working on all intelligence matters for all potential enemies worldwide. The institutional weakness meant that even when intelligence officers identified problems with existing estimates, they lacked the authority to force revisions against the preferences of operations planners who had already committed to specific courses of action. Operations divisions wanted intelligence that confirmed their plans. Intelligence that suggested those plans were based on faulty assumptions was unwelcome. The first indication that American personnel strength exceeded Japanese estimates came surprisingly early during the Guadalcanal campaign that began in August 1942. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, Japanese intelligence had estimated American ground forces at perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 troops total for the initial operation. The actual number exceeded 16,000 Marines on Guadalcanal and Tulagi combined. More importantly, the naval forces supporting the landing included 3 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 14 cruisers, and 31 destroyers, requiring approximately 30,000 naval personnel to operate, not counting merchant marine crews manning transport vessels. Japanese naval officers observing the operation could not understand where all these people had come from. Intelligence estimates suggested total American Pacific Fleet strength should be perhaps 150,000 personnel at this point in the war. But American forces visibly deployed for a single operation were using more than 20% of that estimated total. Either the Americans had stripped every other theater of naval forces to concentrate everything on Guadalcanal, which seemed strategically irrational, or the personnel estimates were wrong. Field commanders sent queries to Tokyo requesting clarification of American strength estimates. The Naval Intelligence Division reviewed their calculations but found no obvious errors in methodology. They had used pre-war American training facility capacities, applied reasonable expansion factors, and arrived at numbers that seemed defensible. The problem was not with the methodology. The problem was with the baseline assumptions about how America would expand those training facilities. In September 1942, a Japanese submarine operating near Pearl Harbor photographed the harbor from periscope depth during a reconnaissance patrol. The photographs, developed and analyzed in Tokyo, showed significantly more vessels than intelligence estimates suggested should be present. Even accounting for ships transferred from the Atlantic Fleet, the number of vessels at Pearl Harbor exceeded projections. But what puzzled analysts more than the ship count was the presence of what appeared to be training vessels and auxiliary craft in large numbers. Why would the Americans base training activities at their primary forward naval base in the Pacific? The answer, which Japanese intelligence failed to grasp, was that American training infrastructure had expanded so rapidly that even forward bases were incorporating training functions to accelerate the pipeline of personnel to operational units. And the second major warning came in November 1942 during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Over 2 nights of chaotic surface engagements, American forces lost 2 cruisers and 7 destroyers, with significant damage to other vessels. Japanese commanders expected that such losses would force the Americans to withdraw or at least pause operations to reconstitute their forces. Instead, within 2 weeks, replacement vessels arrived from Pearl Harbor, and American naval operations around Guadalcanal continued without any visible reduction in tempo. Japanese naval intelligence noted this rapid replacement capability in situation reports, but explained it as the Americans drawing down forces from other theaters. They were still assuming that American naval strength was a fixed pool that could be redistributed but not quickly expanded. By early 1943, accumulated evidence was creating significant cognitive dissonance within the intelligence community. Every major engagement produced observations that seemed inconsistent with existing personnel estimates. American task forces appeared to be larger than expected. American logistics trains supporting forward operations required more vessels and crews than should be available. American bases were more extensively manned than projections suggested possible. Intelligence officers began quietly discussing whether a comprehensive reassessment might be necessary. But no formal review was ordered because doing so would require senior leadership to acknowledge that the strategic planning for the entire war might have been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about enemy capabilities. That kind of admission was institutionally unthinkable. The man who finally forced the issue was Captain Soemu Toyoda, a mid-level intelligence officer assigned to analyze American industrial mobilization. Toyoda had been tracking American ship construction with considerable accuracy throughout 1942 and early 1943. He knew how many carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines the Americans were building. His projections of American fleet strength by tonnage were remarkably close to actual American construction. But in March 1943, Toyoda recognized a mathematical impossibility. The Americans were launching vessels at a rate that would require manning levels far exceeding official Japanese estimates of total American naval personnel. You could not operate a fleet carrier with 5,500 tons of displacement, 90 aircraft, and extensive support infrastructure without approximately 2,500 crew members. You could not operate a fleet of destroyers, each requiring crews of 250 to 300, without having those people trained and available. Toyoda calculated minimum crew requirements for every vessel type in American service and under construction. He used conservative Japanese manning standards, not higher American standards that he didn't yet know about. His calculations showed that to operate the American fleet already in service in March 1943 required approximately 800,000 to 900,000 naval personnel at minimum. That was already double the official estimate of total American naval strength, and American construction was accelerating. If current American building programs continued, by mid-1944, the Americans would have a fleet that required at minimum 1.5 million personnel to operate. Toyoda submitted his analysis through channels with a note that existing personnel estimates required urgent review because they were mathematically incompatible with observed American fleet expansion. The report went to Rear Admiral Takagi Sokichi, who had replaced Ogawa as Director of Naval Intelligence in November 1942. Takagi read the report carefully. He understood the implications. If Toyoda's calculations were correct, then American mobilization was proceeding on a scale Japan had never anticipated. Every strategic plan, every operational assumption, every resource allocation decision was based on estimates that were wrong by a factor of at least 2 and possibly much more. Takagi could have forwarded the report to the Naval General Staff with a recommendation for immediate comprehensive reassessment. Instead, he ordered additional analysis to verify the calculations before bringing such alarming conclusions to senior leadership. The additional analysis took months while intelligence officers debated methodology and scrutinized assumptions. American mobilization continued accelerating. By the time a revised report was ready in September 1943, the situation had worsened considerably. The revised estimates placed American naval personnel strength at approximately 1.2 million as of mid-1943, with projections exceeding 1.8 million by mid-1944 if current trends continued. The report was submitted to the Naval General Staff in October 1943. It included detailed analysis of American training infrastructure, documentation of American construction programs, and mathematical calculations showing that existing Japanese estimates were incompatible with observable reality. The report concluded that American mobilization was proceeding on a scale without historical precedent, and that Japan needed to fundamentally reassess its strategic position based on these revised estimates of enemy strength. The report was classified at the highest level. Circulation was restricted to fewer than 15 officers. No action was taken to revise operational plans or strategic assumptions based on the new estimates. Why? Because acknowledging that intelligence estimates had been wrong by factors of 3 or 4 meant acknowledging that the entire basis for starting the war had been fundamentally flawed. It meant admitting that Japan's military and political leadership had launched the nation into a conflict against an enemy they did not understand and could not defeat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this The institutional incentives all pointed toward containing rather than acting on this information. If field commanders learned that American strength was vastly greater than they had been told, morale would collapse. If the civilian government learned that military intelligence had miscalculated this catastrophically, there would be demands for accountability. If the emperor learned that the war had been started based on estimates that were wrong by factors of 3 to 7, the entire military leadership could be held responsible for what increasingly looked like a strategic disaster of historic magnitude. So the truth was buried. Operations continued based on old assumptions. Field commanders continued planning as if they faced an enemy with limited resources who would eventually reach a breaking point. That breaking point never came, because it was never going to come. The Americans were not operating at the limits of their capacity. They were just getting started. What Japanese intelligence had missed entirely was not just the scale of American mobilization, but the fundamental nature of how America approached the problem of turning civilians into sailors. The United States did not view military training, the way Japan did, as a years-long process of cultivating elite professionals. America viewed training as an industrial process that could be standardized, systematized, and scaled to whatever level was necessary. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy operated 5 major training facilities. Naval Station Great Lakes near Chicago, Illinois, was the largest, designed for approximately 20,000 recruits. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, Great Lakes had 68,000 recruits in training simultaneously. By September 1942, more than 100,000 sailors were training there at the same time. The base expanded from 800 acres to 1,600 acres. Temporary buildings were constructed at unprecedented speed. Barracks that normally took months to build were completed in weeks. Training cycles that had traditionally lasted 16 weeks were compressed to 8 weeks, then to 6 weeks for certain specialties. The facility operated continuously, with new recruit classes beginning every few days rather than every few months. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Naval Station Great Lakes alone trained over 1 million sailors. That single facility, located hundreds of miles from any ocean, produced more trained personnel than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy fielded at its peak wartime strength, and Great Lakes was just the beginning. The United States Navy built entirely new major training stations specifically for wartime mobilization. Naval Training Station Sampson opened in New York in 1942 and could process 20,000 recruits simultaneously. Naval Training Station Farragut opened in Idaho in September 1942 in a remote mountain valley and trained nearly 300,000 sailors before closing in 1945. Naval Training Station Bainbridge opened in Maryland in October 1942. Each facility was built at massive scale using rapid construction techniques that would have seemed impossible to Japanese military planners who were accustomed to careful, methodical base development over years. But the training stations were only part of the story. The United States also created an entirely new system for producing officers that operated on principles completely foreign to Japanese military culture. In July 1943, the Navy launched the V-12 program, a college-based officer training system that operated on 131 university campuses across America. The program took high school graduates and college students, put them on active duty as apprentice seamen, sent them to universities for technical education, and then commissioned them as officers after graduation. Between July 1943 and June 1946, more than 125,000 men went through the V-12 program. That single program produced more officers than Japanese intelligence had estimated the entire American Navy would have in total personnel. The program operated at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Notre Dame, Cornell, Northwestern, and dozens of other universities. Students studied engineering, navigation, communications, and foreign languages. They lived in dormitories converted to military barracks. They attended classes alongside civilian students while subject to military discipline. The program created a pipeline that could produce thousands of technically educated officers every semester. Japanese intelligence never detected it. They knew American universities existed and that some had naval ROTC programs, but they had no conception that the Americans had converted their entire higher education system into military training infrastructure. The cultural gulf between how Japan and America approached mobilization was profound. Japan built its navy through decades of careful cultivation. Officers attended the Naval Academy at Itajima for years of rigorous training. Technical specialists underwent extensive instruction programs. Crews drilled constantly to achieve precision. The emphasis was always on quality, excellence, and professional competence. Developed over extended service, the system produced an outstanding navy, but one that could not expand rapidly or easily replace losses. America took the opposite approach. They decided that scale and sustainability mattered more than individual perfection. They built training systems that could process millions of people. They accepted that individual sailors might initially be less skilled than their Japanese counterparts. They compensated with overwhelming numbers, superior logistics, continuous replacement capability, and the understanding that experience would improve performance over time. An American destroyer that lost crew in combat could return to Pearl Harbor, take on fresh sailors directly from training commands, and be back at sea within 2 weeks. A Japanese destroyer with similar casualties might wait months for replacements, if qualified replacements could be found at all. By late 1943, American production of trained sailors had reached true industrial scale. Great Lakes was graduating classes every few weeks. The V-12 program was commissioning hundreds of new officers every semester. Specialized technical schools were producing radar operators, sonar technicians, fire control specialists, and communications experts in continuous streams. The entire system was self-reinforcing. The more people America trained, the more trainers they had. Graduates became instructors. Officers who completed technical training taught the next class. The pipeline accelerated continuously. Meanwhile, Japan struggled desperately to replace losses that had accumulated since Midway. After the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers and most of the highly trained flight crews aboard them. Those pilots represented years of training and could not be quickly replaced. Japan tried to accelerate pilot training programs, but they lacked sufficient instructors, sufficient aircraft, and sufficient fuel for training flights. Each loss made the problem worse. Fewer experienced pilots meant fewer instructors, which meant lower quality training, which resulted in higher combat losses. It was a death spiral that by late 1943 was well underway and irreversible. The revised intelligence estimate that reached Admiral Toyoda's desk in July 1944 placed American naval personnel at approximately 2.1 million. This was still conservative. The actual number was closer to 2.4 million by that date. But even the conservative estimate was sufficient to make the strategic implications absolutely clear. With 2 million personnel, the United States Navy could simultaneously operate major fleet concentrations in multiple theaters without any mutual support or resource sharing. They could conduct unrestricted offensive operations in the Pacific while maintaining full-strength convoy escort operations in the Atlantic. They could sustain combat losses at rates Japan could never match and still expand total force strength. They could maintain extensive logistics networks, moving supplies across vast ocean distances. They could garrison island bases with permanent personnel rather than rotating limited forces. Every assumption that had informed Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor was invalidated by these numbers. The defensive perimeter strategy assumed limited American forces unable to attack multiple points simultaneously. That assumption was wrong. The quick war scenario depended on American war weariness and willingness to negotiate. That scenario was impossible when America was deploying forces on this scale. The hope that superior Japanese training and fighting spirit could compensate for numerical inferiority collapsed when the numerical inferiority was this extreme. Admiral Toyoda understood all of this immediately when he read the intelligence estimate that morning in July 1944. He was not a political officer, promoted for connections rather than competence. He was a professional naval officer who understood operational mathematics. He had commanded fleets. He knew what logistics required. He understood what sustained operations demanded in terms of personnel, supplies, maintenance, and replacement capability. The numbers in front of him meant that Japan could not win this war through any conceivable operational or tactical approach. The mathematics were absolute. After reading the intelligence estimate, Toyoda requested a private meeting with Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, who served as both Navy Minister and Chief of the Naval General Staff at that time. The meeting occurred on July 22, 1944, at the Navy Ministry in Tokyo. No detailed record of the conversation exists, but the outcome is documented. Toyoda informed Shimada that, based on revised intelligence estimates of American personnel strength, Japan needed to seek immediate negotiation of war termination on whatever terms could be obtained. Continuing the war served no strategic purpose because defeat was mathematically inevitable regardless of how bravely Japanese forces fought. Shimada listened to Toyoda's assessment but rejected the conclusion. Negotiated settlement required leverage. Japan had no leverage in July 1944. The Americans were advancing on multiple fronts and showed no interest in negotiation. Admitting defeat would be politically impossible. The military leadership would be held accountable. The emperor would be forced to intervene. The entire governmental structure might collapse. The war would continue regardless of what intelligence estimates said about long-term probability of success. Toyoda persisted. He asked Shimada how long military leadership believed Japan could continue fighting given the disparity in resources and personnel. Shimada's response was documented in Toyoda's personal diary, which survived the war. Shimada stated that Japan might sustain organized resistance for approximately 6 months to 1 year, depending on whether American invasion of the home islands could be delayed and whether Soviet entry into the war could be prevented. After that, continued resistance would become militarily impossible, regardless of national will. 6 months. That was the calculation senior Japanese naval leadership had arrived at by July 1944. They understood the war was lost. They understood that American strength made defeat inevitable. They knew approximately how long Japan could continue fighting before complete collapse, and they chose to continue the war anyway because the political consequences of admitting defeat were unacceptable to the institutional and cultural framework within which they operated. The intelligence estimate that should have triggered strategic reassessment was instead filed and classified at the highest security level. Distribution was restricted. Field commanders were not informed that American strength was 5 times higher than previous estimates. Operational planning continued based on assumptions everyone at senior levels knew were wrong. The machine of war continued in motion because stopping it required admitting failures that the system could not acknowledge. The consequences of this decision played out over the next 13 months with brutal inevitability. American forces invaded the Philippines in October 1944. Japanese naval forces committed to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, in a desperate attempt to destroy American invasion forces. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Approximately 12,000 Japanese sailors were killed. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after Leyte Gulf. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. Approximately 3,000 American sailors were killed. The Americans replaced their losses within weeks and continued operations without pause. In February 1945, American forces invaded Iwo Jima. In April 1945, American forces invaded Okinawa. Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage. At Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island, but courage could not overcome the material reality of American strength. American forces at Okinawa were supported by a fleet of more than 1,500 ships, operated by more than 300,000 naval personnel. That single operation employed more sailors than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed at the start of the war. The scale of American deployment at Okinawa made visible what Japanese leadership had known since July 1944 but could not publicly acknowledge. Japan was not fighting a war it might lose. Japan was fighting a war it had already lost. The mathematics had been clear for a year. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 9th, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast to the nation. The war was over. In the aftermath, American occupation forces compiled extensive documentation of Japanese intelligence failures. Interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers revealed the depth of the miscalculation regarding American personnel strength. When American interrogators explained the actual scale of programs like V-12 and the expansion of facilities like Great Lakes, Japanese officers were genuinely shocked. Some initially refused to believe the numbers, even when presented with documentary evidence. One Japanese intelligence officer stated in a 1946 interrogation that if someone had told him during the war that America would field a navy of over 3 million people by war's end, he would have considered it impossible propaganda. The concept simply did not fit within Japanese understanding of how military organizations functioned. Admiral Toyoda survived the war and was tried for war crimes at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He was acquitted of all charges and released in 1948. In his post-war memoirs published in 1950, Toyoda wrote about the moment in July 1944 when he realized Japan could not win the war. He described reading the intelligence estimate showing American naval personnel at 2.1 million and understanding immediately that continued resistance was strategically pointless. He calculated that Japan had perhaps 6 months of effective military capability remaining, depending on circumstances. He was remarkably accurate in that assessment. Japan surrendered 13 months after his conversation with Shimada. Toyoda wrote that the greatest tragedy of the Pacific War was not that Japan lost, which was inevitable given the disparity in resources between the nations. The tragedy was that Japanese leadership continued fighting for more than a year after senior commanders knew defeat was certain, resulting in hundreds of thousands of additional deaths that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. The intelligence failure regarding American personnel mobilization was not a failure of data collection. Japanese intelligence had access to significant information about American training programs through multiple channels. Prisoner interrogations provided testimony from Americans who had experienced the training system. Radio intercepts revealed organizational structures suggesting larger force sizes. Ship sighting reports documented American fleet strength in different theaters. The information was available. The failure was analytical rather than empirical. Japanese intelligence officers could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized on the scale America achieved. They looked at raw data and interpreted it through their own cultural framework. They saw an American Navy that would function like the Imperial Japanese Navy because that was the only model they understood. Every piece of evidence was filtered through assumptions about how navies worked, how personnel were trained, how organizations functioned. Those assumptions were based entirely on Japanese experience and were completely wrong when applied to America. The intelligence officers were not incompetent. Many were highly capable analysts, but they were victims of their own cultural assumptions, unable to see beyond institutional frameworks, even when accumulating evidence contradicted those frameworks. The institutional structure made catastrophic miscalculation almost inevitable. Intelligence in the Imperial Japanese Navy was organizationally weak, chronically understaffed, and systematically devalued compared to operational commands. When intelligence officers identified problems with estimates, they lacked authority to force revisions against preferences of senior commanders who wanted confirmation rather than challenge. The system was designed to support decisions already made, not to question strategic premises or challenge fundamental assumptions. This structural weakness meant that even when accurate intelligence existed, it could not effectively influence planning or strategy. The cultural factors reinforced institutional weaknesses. Japanese military culture in this period did not reward officers who delivered unwelcome assessments. Suggesting that the enemy was stronger than estimated was seen as defeatist. The emphasis on offensive spirit, fighting will, and ultimate victory made it culturally difficult to argue that Japan faced insurmountable disadvantages. The combination of institutional weakness and cultural bias created an intelligence system that was structurally incapable of recognizing its own errors, even when evidence accumulated that should have forced reassessment. By the time senior leadership finally acknowledged the scale of American mobilization in July 1944, it was far too late to change the strategic outcome. The war had been lost years earlier, though Japanese forces would continue fighting with desperate courage until the atomic bombs and Soviet entry finally forced surrender. The story of how Admiral Toyoda calculated that Japan had 6 months left after discovering American naval strength of 2.1 million is ultimately a story about the consequences of seeing only what you expect to see. Japan entered the war with assumptions about American limitations that were culturally comfortable and institutionally convenient. They believed America would mobilize slowly, carefully, and on a limited scale because that is how Japan mobilized. They could not imagine an enemy that would transform its entire educational system into military training infrastructure, that would build training bases in the interior of the continent capable of processing 1 million sailors, that would create officer production systems operating on over 100 university campuses simultaneously. The scale of American mobilization was so far beyond Japanese experience that it literally could not be imagined, even when direct evidence accumulated. The lesson is not that Japanese officers were foolish or incompetent. Many were highly intelligent, well-educated, and professionally skilled. The lesson is about the power of cultural assumptions to blind even intelligent people to realities that contradict their expectations. Organizations see what they are prepared to see. They reject information that challenges preferred narratives. Institutional structures determine what evidence is considered credible and whose analysis receives attention. When Japan finally understood the true scale of American strength in July 1944, senior leadership calculated they had approximately 6 months of effective resistance capability remaining. That calculation was accurate, but by then, hundreds of thousands had already died fighting a war that intelligence failures had made unwinnable from the start. The mathematics had been absolute all along. Japan was never fighting a war it might win. Japan was fighting a war against an enemy whose mobilization capacity exceeded Japanese comprehension by factors they could not imagine until it was far too late to matter. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.